My name is Corinne Jackson. I'm the Communications Director for the Okanagan Basin Water Board, and I manage the public outreach program, Okanagan WaterWise. Thank you for joining us for this, part 1, in a special speaker series celebrating the Okanagan Water Board's 50th anniversary. But before we start, I wish to give thanks and acknowledge that we are broadcasting this event from the traditional and unceded territories of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. We know that there are lots of choices tonight as to what you could be tuning into, and we appreciate you choosing to be with us for what we know will be an insightful and inspiring evening. I'll explain the agenda for tonight and then introduce our special guest. Of course, the reason you are here, we have Bob Sandford joining us from Canmore, Alberta, who will provide a presentation. And then our Executive Director, Anna Warwick-Sears, will join Bob on stage, as it were, for a dialogue about where we've been and where we're going when it comes to water in the Okanagan and as a region within an increasingly interconnected and complex world. We will then open up to questions and answers. So it's my pleasure to introduce Bob. As you likely already know, Bob is Global Water Futures Chair in Water and Climate Security at the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health. In this capacity, he was the co-author of the UN Water in the World We Want report on post-2015 Global Sustainable Development Goals relating to water. Bob is also Senior Advisor on Water Issues for the Interaction Council, a global policy forum composed of more than 30 former heads of state, including Jean Chrétien, Bill Clinton, and the former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Brundtland. Bob is also the author, co-author, or editor of more than 30 books, including his most recent Rain Coming Down and the Anthropocene Disruption, published last year. But he has also been a kind of unofficial world ambassador for the Okanagan Basin Water Board for several years now, sharing our triumphs and our challenges with others, connecting us to a broader effort to address water issues here and beyond. And so without further ado, I welcome you, Bob. Good evening.
Thank you so much, Corinne. And it's an honor to be invited to speak on the occasion of this extraordinary anniversary. And please allow me to begin by extending to each of you the very best birthday wishes of the United Nations, to everyone in your basin and to all your partners everywhere. In accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I wish to acknowledge, as you have from the outset, that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures which constitute the common heritage of humankind. And it's to the common heritage of all humanity that I wish to direct my remarks today. So please allow me to begin by explaining my work. What is interesting about my work in the context of your basin is that I do what you do, and my work is what yours has become also. The foundation of our work together is science. And it seems to me that the commandments of science can be reduced to 2: to tell the truth and to stand up for all humanity and for the planet now and generations into the future. Good science involves not just the sharing of knowledge about the world. It is a candle we light when we want to see and be warmed by the truth. In our collective case, however, our mutual task is to bring ongoing scientific research outcomes to bear on the crafting of timely, durable, and effective, actionable public policy. And I wish to offer to you that there's probably never been a time in history when it's been more important to understand what science is telling us about the dangerous disconnect between our current societal direction and a sustainable future, and to translate what science demonstrates into effective action, something that you have been doing for 50 years. So let's look at those 50 years in an historical context. A lot was happening in 1970. I have to say that it was a heavy time, a very heady time. And while overshadowed by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, singers like Joni Mitchell, Gordon Lightfoot, and John Prine were already defining the values we needed to have. And that year, a lot of the foundations of today's environmental protections were being laid down in Canada. And you were in good company in 1970. That year saw the signing of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, the passage of the Canada Water Act, and also the first Earth Day. And your invitation to speak at this celebration closes something of a circle for me, in that I participated in an environmental demonstration held in Calgary on that first Earth Day. And it's interesting to track our progress nationally and globally over the 50 years since that first Earth Day. And we can do that by tracking, marking, and observing Earth Overshoot Day, the day each year when humanity will have used all of the biological resources that Earth can renew during the entire year. And while there has been much success at local and regional levels, such as yours, we have not been successful in meeting critical environmental challenges on a global scale. Since 1969, the Global Footprint Network has marking the date each year upon which humanity begins to overshoot the Earth's ability to regenerate natural resources in that same year. And what's interesting is that 1970 was the last year humanity stayed within anything close to a safe budget with respect to its ecological considerations. 50 years ago, the planet could sustain our population and provide for its needs for just over the entire year. But as the decades passed, we began using up the Earth's annual bounty earlier and earlier. In 2001, Earth Overshoot Day fell in early October. In 2017, it fell on August 2nd. That year, it was calculated that we needed the equivalent of 1.7 Earths to sustain our population at current levels of need and demand. And it looked at that time, we were on our way to plundering ourselves out of house and home. But this year, something very different happened. Earth Overshoot Day this year fell on August 22nd, more than 3 weeks later than it did in 2019. And the later date reflects the 9.3% reduction in humanity's ecological footprint from January 1st to Earth Overshoot compared to the same period last year, which of course is a direct consequence of the coronavirus-induced lockdowns around the world. This sudden year-over-year contraction of humanity's ecological footprint, however, is far from the intentional change in the way we function as a society that we need to have if we are to achieve ecological balance, while at the same time ensuring human well-being, two of the most critical measures of true sustainability. Humanity this year still used 60% of the Earth's natural abundance, more of the natural abundance than what can be renewed. It's as much as we would have lived on 1.6 planets. But let's go back to 1970 and to the birth of the Okanagan Basin Water Board. In the late 1960s, it became clear that the failure to manage water in the Okanagan effectively would limit economic growth, and that new levels of cooperation were necessary to prevent further deterioration of the health of the lake. And this led to the creation of the first Okanagan Pollution Control Council in 1968. And fortuitously, this coincided with the creation of regional districts in the province. It was the movement in the direction of regional governance that made the idea of an Okanagan Basin Water Board possible. In 1970, John O'Riordan, who later became the Deputy Minister for the Environment for British Columbia, worked in this federal government in Ottawa. And he explains that 50 years ago, the Okanagan Plan would not have been developed and would not have succeeded without cooperation of all levels of government. That the Okanagan Basin Water Board was able to achieve the goals of the 1970 to 1974 Okanagan study over time, and much more over time, is a testament to the power of that cooperation. And in this, there is much that reminds me of the creation of the United Nations, which is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. The founders of the Okanagan Basin Water Board faced exactly the same obstacles and challenges as the fledgling UN. The origins of the Okanagan Basin Water Board and the UN are certainly similar in this regard. It's difficult today to recapture the optimism and high spirits of those who thought that a new world order was possible or had perhaps already arrived. And like the United Nations, the Okanagan Basin Water Board is not unlike the boulder Sisyphus tried to roll uphill, only to have it repeatedly roll back to the bottom. It has slipped, but only for a while. And of course, the visionaries who founded your organization were overly optimistic. It appears all who roll boulders uphill tend to be like that, and your work will never be easy. Like the UN, the Okanagan Basin Water Board will never be able to escape the fundamental paradox of all cooperative bodies. It performs only as well as its members will permit and support. Former US Ambassador to the UN, Richard Holbrooke, expressed this paradox famously. Blaming the UN for a crisis is like blaming Madison Square Gardens when the New York Knicks play badly. You're blaming a building. The boulder, however, is still only halfway up the mountain, and to advance it further, to create the future we want and need, much effort is still needed. So let's now look at where we stand compared to the rest of the world in Canada and in the Okanagan Basin with respect to the creation of truly effective 21st century water policy. And it just so happens that I recently completed a synthesis that seeks to offer comparative international water policy example as a guide to the creation of a Canadian water agency. Effective 21st century water policy in this context is defined as that which proactively addresses the kinds of new and intensifying water challenges we know will demand new approaches to freshwater management for the rest of the century in Canada. And these challenges include climate change, an increase in water-related climate disasters, which I'm sure Anna will talk about later, biodiversity loss, fragmented water governance, and also unresolved and uncharacterized Indigenous water rights. So a brief summary of that synthesis might be of real interest to you as you contemplate the next 50 years of the Okanagan Basin Water Board. So let's start with 21st century national water policy as it presently stands in Australia, a continent similar to the size of Canada, and certainly facing many similar problems and organized similarly. By the late 1990s, the depth of economic and social upheaval caused by the appearance of permanently persistent drought in Australia demanded changes in almost every institution in the country. And despite enormous resistance from interests that previously could never have conceived of such a development, it became clear that the only way the problem could be managed was to have individual states relinquish some of their powers to the federal government. A National Water Commission was created in 2004, and under the Independent Commission, fragmented and territorial political jurisdictions were forced to work together. Even as drought situation worsened, however, Australia was well on its way to creating an effective 21st century national water policy. But then Australia decided to go backwards rather than forwards. And after being elected, the Liberal National Coalition Party, led by Tony Abbott, used his opposition to a proposed mining profits tax, emissions trading schemes, and a carbon tax as an excuse to abolish the National Water Commission in 2014. Since then, Australia has experienced drought and fire extremes of an order of magnitude beyond the very worst case model scenarios. The habitable parts of Australia are now crowded with traumatized local climate refugees whose lives have been set back years, if not permanently. A rapidly warming climate in tandem with divisive, retrograde national water policy, compounded by the effects of the pandemic, have created circumstances in which the creation of a coherent 21st century national water policy has receded beyond Australia's grasp, perhaps permanently. Now let's compare that with where the United States presently stands with respect to crafting of meaningful, effective, and durable 21st century water policy. Like Australia, the United States was well on its way in the 1990s to create a coherent and an effective national water policy. By the early 2000s, it was recognized, just as it was in Australia, that the problems with respect to water in the US were too complicated for any one jurisdiction to address, and that greater federal leadership was required. A US equivalent of a national water agency was proposed. And for a time, it appeared that proponents of a 21st century US water policy would get what so many wanted. In 2012, ground was broken for the construction of a US National Water Center in Alabama. The same year, the importance of considering water in the context of national security was recognized in an assessment by the US intelligence community. And in early 2017, the federal government went so far as to release its US Global Water Strategy, which proposed that solutions to the country's water issues could be coordinated through the creation of an interagency water group, working group comprised of 17 representatives of 17 different US federal agencies. But then, again, things went sideways. And the reason? Donald Trump. Trump, burning to undo Barack Obama's legacy, has rolled back more than 100 environmental policies and regulations. And in this respect, it could be said that in terms of the capacity to deal with the growing pressures of managing water in a hotter, more crowded, and more conflicted world, the situation in the United States is very similar to that of Australia, but in reverse. Well, in Australia, the primary threat to creating effective policy is seemingly out of control climate change exacerbated by social and political divisiveness. And this is really quite interesting because at present, it is much social and political divisiveness in climate, as opposed to climate change itself, that is causing effective 21st century national water policy to again recede perhaps permanently beyond the reach of the United States. So let's look now at how the European Union is doing with respect to the crafting of 21st century water policy, which is to say water policy that addresses the global issues I identified. Perhaps because of the reduced relative influence of the fossil fuel sector in Europe as a whole, the European Water Framework Directive has perhaps become the best example to which the world can turn in terms of development of effective 21st century national and transnational water policy. The European Union Water Frame Directive came into existence because of a common desire of the 18 countries that share it to clean up the entire transboundary course of the Danube River so as to restore the deteriorating health of the Black Sea. The EU built a foundation upon which cooperation could flourish. It did so first by establishing a strong legal basis for higher common management standards, and then following up on those standards with strong enforcement, while at the same time collaborating on the development of creative implementation mechanisms that have built into common implementation strategies. The EU solidified this foundation by first forging trusting relationships between representatives of member states, setting highly ambitious goals based on measurable results and meaningful consequences for non-compliance. But at the same time, however, it established creative and reliable sources of funding to ensure every member state could ultimately improve water resource management at the same time and at the same ever improving high standards. No one has been left behind. So it's interesting. In 2019, I traveled down the Danube to observe if the promise of the European Union Water Framework Directive continued to be realized. And in following the downstream course of the river from Germany through Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, it's impossible not to come face to face with the region's long history of almost endless warfare and conflict. Now, however, peace, open borders, and free trade prevail, creating the most secure and prosperous period in all of the history of Europe. This peace and prosperity are gifts of cooperation. And in this regard, the creation of the European Union water framework and the Union itself must be seen as the greatest public policy achievement in Europe in the last 1,000 years. And with respect to the ongoing effectiveness of the water framework, one only has to look at the degree of cooperation with which the river is managed. Passing through one of its many locks, it's impossible not to notice that the river is run with the precision of a Swiss watch. And this same precision radiates out from the river to the shore and far beyond, establishing the time movements of tens of millions of people who live in the catchment, the movements of millions of tourists, and all the freight and supplies locals and visitors alike rely on to sustain them. So from this, one could surmise that the European Union Water Framework Directive is the foundation of the entire region's social stability, unimagined economic prosperity, and environmental sustainability. Water is holding Europe together and making it prosperous, which is as it should be. Now let's look at where we are with respect to 21st century national water policy in Canada. The only way forward toward a 21st century national water policy for Canada is through the creation of a strong, unifying federal focus on water governance and management. And that will require what it required in Europe: active, not passive trust building, established through the building of strong and durable interpersonal relations, the establishment and adoption of ambitious common goals and targets, clearly measurable results with meaningful consequences for non-compliance, and ongoing help for those who have trouble keeping up. And all of those goals should be, or could be, achieved through the creation of a Canada Water Agency. And we have the European Union model to guide us. So in the central part of Canada, Lake Winnipeg is our Black Sea. In the Great Lakes region, Lake Erie. And here in your basin, your precious lakes are really your Black Sea. But on a larger scale, it will be the success of the reconsideration of the Columbia River Treaty that will define on a larger stage whether you have truly achieved lasting, effective 21st century water policy. So I have observed for a long time that you're on your way in this basin to highly enlightened and successful 21st century water policy. And that policy is still very much within your grasp. In comparable global terms, you're still in a very sweet spot. You are not deeply and irrevocably divided in your basin and in your province by the social, political, ideological, and viral pathologies that have infected the US. There's no question that hydroclimatic regimes in your region of British Columbia have accelerated in intensity as expressed by increasing variability, but climate change has not gotten away on you like it has in Australia or parts of the United States. You can still create the basin you want in the future, but I would submit to you, you need to do it now. And I worry about that. If there's a flaw in your strategic plan, in my view, it is that it lacks urgency. There's optimism and promise, certainly, but little urgency. You are very clear on emerging risks. You should expect and plan for flooding of magnitudes you haven't experienced before. You can expect multi-year, if not decadal drought in this century. You can expect warming temperatures, heat waves, and longer, hotter fire seasons. And you also have a lot of very expensive and very vulnerable infrastructure that will be in harm's way in a warmer climate. You have to get ahead of climate change while you can still afford to. What you are going to face in the next 50 years of life in the basin is going to make that challenge very difficult. So let's look now at some of the things you will have to deal with in your next half century. You've already comprehensively researched what to expect in terms of climate change impacts, so I won't bother touching on what you already know. Let me instead put before you some of the knock-on or second-order effects that accelerating global climate disruption are already causing. And you can determine for yourself how ready you are in your basin for this coming storm. As we have predicted for some time, when you lose hydrologic stationarity and stability, it isn't long before you can lose social and political stationarity and stability as well. One leads to the other, and this is what is happening widely. We can expect growing and explosive political and social turmoil in our neighborhood and around the world. And this is already resulting in growing voluntary and involuntary human migration, even on this continent. And I submit to you that your failure to control population in your basin is already one of the threats to meaningful sustainability that you face now and will face in the future. But I'm putting on notice that you ain't seen nothing yet. Unfortunately, we do not have good data even on current migration patterns country to country or even within countries. At present, wage and work opportunities are held to be the most recognized driver of migration. That, however, is beginning to change. The spatial distribution of human population is increasingly defined by environmental factors. Today, 1% of the terrestrial Earth is considered utterly uninhabitable. Get this, the projection is that climate heating will increase that number to 20% in this century. The data we do have suggests that we're heading toward, not away from, danger. In the United States, Florida and California, those are the states that are leading the way there. After Hurricane Andrew devastated the Bahamas, Louisiana, and Florida in August of 1992, insurance companies refused to offer coverage for hurricane damage. And to ensure that this did not drive people from the coastal regions, the state of Florida started to cover home insurance. How long it can afford to do so remains to be seen. In a similar vein, California provides publicly funded firefighting. Similarly, a pipeline provides water to Phoenix, Arizona. Migration will be a principal adaptation strategy as incentives for staying in dangerous places prove increasingly inadequate. So then the question becomes this: how do you prevent climate disasters rather than simply accepting that you will have to pay the huge and increasing mental health costs and the ever-mounting costs of cleanup and recovery? There are similarities between what is happening in California and what is happening in Australia. Both are experiencing longer, hotter summers. Both have allowed huge fuel buildups by choosing to suppress fire hazard rather than managing it. And both are experiencing deep and persistent drought and higher winds that make wildfires bigger, hotter, and faster moving. By mid-century, we should expect double the number of people exposed to catastrophic fire regime in both of these places. And places where people once lived may no longer be habitable or may not exist anymore. There has, of course, always been climate migration, but it's never occurred on this scale before. The rate and extent of climate migration that we face now is unprecedented in all of human history. And as we've seen, current migration patterns have already prompted protectionist, isolationist reactions. The plain fact is we simply don't have adequate infrastructure or healthcare to deal with large-scale involuntary human migration that climate disruption is projected to create, nor is there enough food. The question hanging over this is, what will it take for us as a species to recognize the clear and present danger to which we've exposed ourselves, not just ourselves, but all future generations by ignoring the climate threat? We know what to do, but how do we get to the point we do it? So we are reaching a pain threshold in terms of impacts and costs. A transformational moment is before us, and it's before you. The alarms went off years ago and we ignored them. The fire is now out of control and there's nothing that can stop it from burning our house down. The habitable zone in the United States is already shrinking northward toward Canada. Parts of South Florida, the Carolinas, the American West, and Southwest are projected soon to be barely habitable. Where are these people going to go? Many of them will want to come to Canada. This movement northward will occur globally. They are coming, So get ready. And there's something else we need to watch carefully in the next half century, and that's the growing seductive lure of authoritarianism. What we're seeing now is that powerful forces are harnessing big data analytics to reach into the minds of the public to mine information related to our deepest biases and preferences, and to reshape, manipulate, and mobilize them. And what we found after 2 decades of big data analysis is that about 1/3 of the population of any country has what might be called an authoritarian predisposition. And what these interests are doing is appealing to people who cannot tolerate complexity. And there's nothing intrinsically left-wing or right-wing about the instincts to which these interests appeal. What they've been able to tap into is a buried suspicion many of us hold deep in our minds of people with different ideas. And this is the part of our deep makeup that is allergic to measured, common debates based on the common good. Now, whether those who have this predisposition are socialists or libertarians is completely irrelevant. The disposition is a frame of mind, not a set of ideas. And authoritarian leaders have learned to appeal to that frame of mind. And the kinds of authoritarian leaders that are emerging regionally and around the world are apocalyptic. Often they're convinced that their societies have failed and need to be reconstructed, whatever the result. Some are deeply religious, some enjoy chaos or seek to promise chaos as a prelude to imposing a new kind of order. But all of them seek to redefine their nations or their regions, or in the case of places like Alberta, to rewrite social contracts, and in some cases, in other places, to alter the rules of democracy so that ruling parties never lose power. So what I'm telling you is, it's not just the water in the basin that you're going to have to watch for, it's the milieu in which we manage water. The next 50 years is going to be a dangerous time. Either we remake the world, or we should prepare ourselves for a time of unparalleled injustice. So, how does the Okanagan Basin Water Board survive the storm now and over the next 50 years? Well, the first way is to continue to learn from and build on your past. You already know what entire nations are still struggling to learn about the management of water resources and what they need to know to adapt to and ultimately survive climate disruption. And it's all about trust and cooperation. Without the ongoing support and full trust of all who are invested in the well-being and the people who live in your basin, as defined by the health of your lakes and aquatic ecosystems, you're just a name. So you need, in my view, to have greater confidence in your vision for the future. In my outside view, you are doing way more to benefit your basin than your strategic plan lets on. You might want to note somewhere that your priorities and vision align with and are very consistent with the United Nations 2030 Transforming Our World Global Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I mentioned that not just because Canada's been slow to step up to the plate with respect to acknowledging and effectively working to achieve these goals, but because the goals in your own strategic plan, which it aims to take you well into the next 50 years, are linked in the same way that the Sustainable Development Goals are, in that all your goals have to be achieved, or ultimately none will be. So we all know that we face too many problems to address them one at a time. We know we need solutions that address multiple problems simultaneously. And your plan does that, but it doesn't fully acknowledge it. In order to get more from your strategies, you may wish to show how they support one another and really do address multiple problems simultaneously, giving benefit to things that aren't even mentioned in the plan. So to see how you might frame your goals and targets in a way that shows how they reinforce one another in the broader interests of an unstated common good, you may wish to look at how the UN Transforming Our World Global Sustainable Development Agenda is constructed and how the interlinked goals are meant to generate results that are far more than the sum of their parts. In essence, the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is both a moral and a biological and hydrological, I should say, ecology. The Sustainable Development Goals form an organic whole. Each of its 17 distinguishing elements stand in relation to each of the others. And while it's possible and sometimes necessary to concentrate on just one, such as Goal 6 pertaining to water, the goals are intricately linked. They're not separate blocks that we can snap together. So the question becomes this: how do you connect 17 goals and 169 targets in a way that nation states can effectively reorder their public policy around water and other elements within a time frame that will make a difference? Well, with the umbrella of planetary health in mind, we see how the 17 goals and 169 targets can be reordered so that they make sense in our own national and subnational circumstances, and how they relate to one another in terms of achieving a meaningful level of true sustainability globally. So how does water fit into this? Well, one of the ways to re-energize the conversation about sustainable development and humanity's need for resilience in the face of rapid change is to talk about something that none of us can live without: water, and you do that. All of the 17 UN's goals can be achieved by realizing the link between water, water security, climate stability, and human and planetary health. So think of it this way: water security means clean water and sanitation for all. It means managing water on a basin scale, which means protecting aquatic ecosystems, which improves life on land and life below water, which leads to improvements in agriculture, will help end hunger and also help to end poverty. And meanwhile, in a manner that will help end hunger and poverty, this cannot be done without innovation and infrastructure. But innovation and infrastructure development cannot come into existence without quality education, which demands gender equality, which in itself leads to reduced inequality. Gender education, gender equity, and reduced inequality lead to economic growth. And it's only through economic stability that we'll be able to make a smooth transition to an affordable and clean energy supply for all, which is a critical step toward climate action. And climate action will help restore planetary health, therefore contributing to better physical and mental health and well-being for all. So you get the picture. What this does is it allows people to see that each goal relates to the others and to the larger goals as a whole. And your goals do that. And I urge you to see how much more are in your goals and in their interconnection than you have now. And each year, another thing that's interesting, the signatory nations are expected to go around the entire basis again to measure real progress. And in the last global review, it was observed that more progress had been made in some as opposed to others. But even though there was a great deal that remained to be done, the Sustainable Development Goals continue, against all odds in some cases, still to be within reach. So what excites me most about the next 50 years of the Okanagan Water Basin Board is that this anniversary coincides with a landmark turning point in the human journey on this planet. We are in the midst of a transformational moment. And in this, there's much we can actually learn from the pandemic. What the pandemic proved was that when they put human lives above all else, governments are capable of acting swiftly, both in terms of regulation and spending. We can change the entire direction of society. The object, however, should be to do so intentionally, not by way of mass human suffering as a consequence of unexpected national disaster or pandemic. But you already knew that. You also know that to create the world we want in a more orderly way with less pain, we need to rely on science and make sure that science drives timely evidence-based decision-making at all levels of government based on ongoing monitoring. And you have known that for a long time. And you already know that we're all in this together. And like the European Union, you already learned that the great importance of cooperation. And you also know that something that much of the rest of Canada is yet to learn: the extraordinary, powerful, meaningful impression of ongoing reconciliation with Indigenous people and with the planet. And you found the perfect symbol for establishing common values, the salmon. And in Storm Warming, Water and Climate Security in a Changing World, a book I dedicated to Anna and to the Okanagan Basin Water Board, I observed that whenever there was salmon, we also find indigenous peoples whose cultural heritage has linked them directly to the ecological energy of the Columbia River for hundreds of generations. And through a willingness to restore salmon, you've shown that the road is open for reconciliation, for correcting the mistakes of the past, and for collaboration on a better, more secure, more just, and ultimately far more sustainable future for all. And that collaboration began with water and with the Columbia. And is there any reason why we can't start down that road again and that river together now? No, there isn't. I saw it happen right before my eyes at the Environmental Flow Conference I attended in Kelowna in October of 2018. And that was, as I told Nelson Nuttall, one of the most productive and inspiring conferences I have ever attended. And since then, I've told everyone I know about it. But that was then. Where are we now? Well, the most immediate risk at this moment in the human journey is that our society will lapse into some different but still functionally unaltered vision of what we had before the pandemic, which would be a disaster leading only to the next disasters. The world won't be and shouldn't be the same again. And as I hope this webinar demonstrates, our interest should reside in not recreating the world we had, but rather in creating the world we want and the world we need to have if we are to perpetuate tolerable living conditions for ourselves and for the rest of life on this planet in the future. But as you all know in your basin, this project is not for the faint of heart. COVID has stopped society in its tracks. The pandemic has created what I hope history will remember as the Great Pause. And in a way, like teenagers, we're grounded until we get grounded. And we have before us a moment during which we can turn this great pause and the catastrophe that caused it into an opportunity for global reset and for the emergence of new hope for the future. But to make that transformation, we have to act on behalf of that hope. And the mobilization of hope is the precondition of effective action. The first thing I think that we need to realize, if we are to address the climate threat in time, that we do all need reconciliation. Reconciliation first with one another and at the same time with the earth. We know what indigenous peoples have known for thousands of years. We can reduce and moderate the threat of climate disruption by protecting, restoring, and constantly rehabilitating natural system function. And from this, we see that this is not the end of the world at all. It's just the beginning of another. And perhaps because we're so connected, people today, as this pandemic has demonstrated, have expanded capacity to think in terms of community rather than just thinking about themselves. And there is great power in realizing this. For as you know, it's at the local level, at the level at which the Okanagan Basin functions, that we have the most power to effect change and to act most effectively in service of where and how we live and who we love now and in the future. So to that end, and in complete harmony with what you are doing in this basin, in your basin, the UN is calling for a global restoration imperative. If such an imperative goes beyond environment, it would demand that we first restore local identity and humanity's sense of place and connection. It demands that we restore truth, restore responsibility to human dignity, economic morality and equality, and in so doing, restore common purpose and a vision for the future of humanity and the planet. All things you are working to do in your basin. But most urgently of all, such an imperative must become an immediately effective vehicle for not just the protection, but for the rapid restoration of critical natural system function so that we can restore balance in the world and step back from the climate crisis. We are at a crossroads and we're running out of time. The need to get on top of this pandemic and get ahead of the climate disruption that is before us is critical at this time. You live in one of the places in the world where you can still do that, but to create hope, we need to work together, all of us. And what I think we need now is a second, very new and different enlightenment, but no enlightenment can proceed without a renaissance. And it's worth reminding ourselves that humanity's first renaissance was born in Italy following an epidemic of the Black Plague in the 14th century. Well, maybe this is time for another. All of us need to be that next renaissance, to be that new and wiser beginning as you are. A better world is possible. To make that world possible, however, we need to harness the energy, clear-sighted intelligence, and courage of our youth. We must do this. They are our future. No one is too young or too old to be part of that renaissance. I'm not, you're not, all are invited. So you've got it started. Let the renaissance that you have begun radiate out from here now for the rest of the century from this, the 50th anniversary of the Okanagan Basin Water Board. And in my view, this is a transformational moment, and I urge you to seize it. Seize it now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for your insights. And as always, you've left us with much to think about and work towards in terms of a more sustainable Okanagan and planet. So I'm going to reintroduce Anna. So Anna's joined us here. And as the conversation unfolds between Anna and Bob, we invite you to enter your questions for Bob and or Anna into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And once we're done with Bob and Anna having their discussion, we'll get to questions from folks that are tuning in.
Wow. Boy, it's great to see you, Bob. Great to have you back.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's I thought it was really fitting to have you come and make this presentation for us because you've spent so much time in the Okanagan and you've been with us through so many changes. And so, you know, you have a perspective on the little watershed of the Okanagan as well as all these other places in the world. So it's really interesting. I really appreciate the encouragement, you know, that confidence that you hold in us, and also your link to all of these other interesting things that are happening around the world. So I'm really glad that you came.
Thank you so much. And I must say, it's just a pleasure. And when you asked me if I would do this, of course I accepted, because I have very fond memories of and have very strong belief in what you're doing with your water board, and also you have so many nice and wonderful people down there. I miss you all.
Yeah, too bad you couldn't be here in person, and hopefully you can come next year for our Osoyoos Lake Water Forum, which we're hoping to have in the fall of 2021. You were there at the last one in 2015, and it's been a few years, but it'd be great.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Anyway, I took a bunch of notes and I have some questions just to kind of get the audience warmed up. I think first one that's really been a hot topic of conversation is the new Canadian Water Agency. You mentioned it in your talk, but I know that you have an insider perspective, and I just wondered if you could tell us what the status of that agency is and what would a Canadian water agency do? It seems like a mysterious, amorphous thing.
Well, thank you very much for that question. It's interesting because on Wednesday, September 23rd, the Governor General of Canada in her throne speech made the historic announcement that the federal government would at last create a national water agency. As she said, the government will create a new Canada Water Agency to keep our water safe, clean, and well managed. And it's really interesting that including that in the throne speech, in doing so, the federal government acknowledged that Canada is facing new and intensifying water challenges in the 21st century that demonstrate for the need for a new approach to freshwater management. And of course, the challenges, the most prominent of the challenges we face, are the ones I've mentioned: climate change, water-based natural disasters, unresolved and uncharacterized Indigenous water rights, biodiversity issues, and fragmented watershed governments.
And would the agency handle all of those?
Well, here's what the notion is. Addressing these challenges and ensuring that Canada's waters are healthy requires modernized federal freshwater leadership. And this would be the first step in modernizing federal water leadership. You have to remember the Canada Water Act hasn't been modified in 40 years. There's all sorts of things. And the exact structure and mandate of a new agency are going to take time to figure out, but the key roles of the water agency must fulfill are clear. And once the foundation's established, the agency's mandate and functions should be co-developed with Indigenous nations and in close collaboration with provincial and territorial governments, local authorities, water organizations like yours, and the general public. And it's really interesting. The agency represents both a concrete short-term achievement and the beginnings of a lasting water legacy. So here there's just a few key roles: to create and mobilize knowledge needed to predict and respond to water problems and opportunities, to strengthen transboundary water management and cooperative federalism, to strengthen reconciliation on a common basis with Indigenous peoples, and improve collaborative river basin planning by building durable partnerships for water management and decision-making with provinces, territories, municipalities, and Indigenous governments. And one of the things that clearly we're aiming at here is integrated flood and drought prediction and forecasting, and which no individual province or jurisdiction can do on its own. So steps are these. The first is to establish the agency, and that first step was taken in the throne speech. But we know that making an announcement is one thing, making it so is quite another. So the next step would be to initiate co-development of the mandate and the function of the agency with Indigenous people, and then commit financial and other resources in the budget of 2021. So we're still at a preliminary stage here, but there is many water organizations of the country have identified this need over a very long period of time. And it's their collective voice that is driving the pressure for the government to create such an agency and to do so soon.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of needs. I mean, I don't know if I want to get started yet, but certainly the main way that we've interacted with the federal government over the last number of years has been through the water survey and the federal government's role at water monitoring. And I really have my hopes up that the federal Canada Water Agency would do a lot to build out that function of the federal government.
Well, I think it certainly aims to, and again, collecting national scale and continental scale data that everyone can use in their flood and drought forecasting has to be a benefit to everyone, because it's not, you know yourself that it's really hard to do that. And even though you might collect such data in your own basin, you need a broader sense of that if you want to be able to truly address the changes that are likely to happen and to assess the threats that those changes might pose in your own basin.
Another thing that would be really cool is if the federal government would open up the satellite data so that we could use that for some of the weather forecasting and hydrological modeling and all of the things that you can use satellite.
Well, that's really important, Anna, because Global Water Futures, which is the largest university-led water and water-related climate research initiative in the world, is trying to bring together for Canada not just the data for our country, but the data for the entire continent, so that we'll be able to, and that's within our grasp. And I think that will happen before Global Water Futures mandate is completed 3 years hence. So that's the sort of thing that could provide absolute breakthroughs nationally, continentally, that in terms of data supply and understanding could be a great service no matter where you live in the country. It could be a tremendous service to basins such as yours.
Yeah, I people in the viewing audience may not know, but for many years that data, the satellite data has been locked up, and it's been a user pay system. So people who are like us, kind of, you know, on a shoestring budget, we don't have access to those kind of data.
Well, there's another thing too, Anna, is that there's a great deal of data that is collected that's not interpreted. And we need to know more about how we can better do that. And a water agency that represents the entire country and can work with American equivalents on this, and which Global Water Futures is already doing. This could provide tremendous benefit to all.
Well, let's stay in touch about that, and let us know how we can help, you know, support it and push it along, really. Next thing I had in my notes to ask you about is that the divisiveness that is happening around on the globe. I was in Australia in 2010, and we saw this great movement toward integrated water management across the Murray-Darling Basin, and it was really tragic to see it fall apart. We certainly see divisiveness going on in the US. Do you feel like the same kind of divisiveness is a threat to what we're trying to do with water management in Canada?
Well, I still think that we try, or certainly are positioned well to cooperate on water management. But again, as has happened in the United States and Australia, if your political circumstances are not orchestrated in a way that will help you, it can be even more difficult to do it. In fact, it could also lead to retrogression in terms of that. Now, when we look at divisiveness, I mean, we're all, probably many of us got an eye on the screen of tonight's television debate, but we know what divisiveness looks like if you look at the United States. And Canada is a generation behind the US in terms of the divisiveness in public discourse. I mean, it's now polarized and binary in Canada, and we see that federally, and certainly where I live. But in the US, it's become quite personalized, and you know, I hate you because you think differently than I do, and that's a dangerous way to go. So what we have to do is fight that. We have to see that as a threat. And I live in Alberta, where the joke is, well, we got the best government your money can buy. And we are heading directly in the direction of deep and bitter divisiveness, something that all of us must fight against. All of us must stand in the way of moving in that way. We have to keep our channels open. We have to talk to one another. We have to see just how important cooperation is, because if we let our relations fall apart or become so partisan that we can't cooperate with one another, then the future is not going to be very good for us.
You know, it's funny that just because it's really not my experience here. I mean, I would say maybe this is one way that the Okanagan is anomalous, is we really, seems like over the last decade, communities have gotten better and better at working together, reaching across jurisdictional boundaries and finding all the things that we have in common.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I have so much respect for your basin. And also, I would submit to you too, Anna, that I look at British Columbia, and I think you're right there. As a province, you haven't got the deep-seated divisiveness, certainly, that we have here in Alberta. And you see the potential for it elsewhere. I mean, you certainly saw the potential for it in Ontario before the virus struck and brought people together. But again, I think it's something we've got to watch out for, because it can creep into your system easily. And the degree of cooperation that you've shown is an example to the rest of the country and the world. And that's why we want to celebrate your 50th anniversary, and also celebrate the values and the direction in which you've headed. And that's one of the reasons why I like to tell your story wherever I am, because it's a story of keeping things together and believing in one another and working toward a better society through managing water differently, better, and more comprehensively.
Well, it's certainly a happier way to live.
Yeah.
So if this is a transformational moment for us here in the Okanagan, isn't it also a transformational moment for the rest of the country? Where do you think this transformation is going to go? out of the.
Well, I think that that's very interesting because some people don't think that's the case, but you're certainly seeing evidence on a national basis. I mean, I just look, for example, at what was said in the throne speech. You know, government's promised to lock into low interest rates for generations to come. It's promised to make tax measures, to make the rich and technology companies pay their share. In building back better, the federal government's not going to return to the status quo. The federal government plan will exceed 2030 emissions reductions targets, and they said boldly that we'll be at zero emissions by mid-century. And also they promised 1 million jobs to be created across Canada in support of climate action. And again, they mentioned of creating a Canada Water Agency. And also, one thing that I think is really important here, Canada will at last become truly signatory and committed to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And those are transformational steps, and I ache for them to come true, and I ache for the promise to be fulfilled. And that could be transformational for us, even in the midst of a difficult situation.
Well, let's turn the tables. You got any questions for us and Okanagan Basin Water Board?
Well, I do actually have some questions for you. I haven't talked to you for some time, and I'm eager to ask you some questions. So first of all, maybe could you outline the Okanagan Basin Water Board's plans for the next few years?
You know, I kept thinking about this during your talk. You know, all of the things going on with climate, of course, are huge here. And the biggest thing that came out this summer, really in the last couple of months, is something you touched on about the need to integrate flood and drought prediction and forecasting. What we have here, we've been thinking like a watershed. That's important. You know, working on restoration. We're seeing that that's important, how important it is to have this healthy watershed all the way up to the mountains and find more ways to make our stream systems better, infiltrate the water, all of this stuff. But we're also being hit by these monster weather systems that are really unpredictable, and it's very hard to, you know, hard to manage out of it. It's like, okay, we can think on a watershed scale, but we actually have to think bigger than that. And something that came up, you know, we finished this big 3-year project to do flood mapping, and we discovered that we also need to look at the management of the lake as a whole, which is, you know, we have a natural lake, but it's a managed system. So the dam operator, who's a provincial employee in Penticton, he controls the gates and of the dam in Penticton, and he can only let out a 1.5 centimeters of water at a time when it's flowing into Okanagan Lake. But sometimes there's like 5-6 centimeters a day coming in. So the lake level goes up, you know, inexorably. You can't kind of manage your way out of it. But there's different things you could do. You can let the water out earlier in the winter. You can, you know, let it out for longer. You can have a lower target that you're aiming for before you let out more big flows. And the thing is that if we do that, if we, as Sean Reimer says, dig a hole in the lake in the winter, anticipating a flood year, and then we don't get the rain or the snowpack, then we're in a deficit situation in the lake. And, you know, the droughts are also unpredictable and coming, you know, 2019 was a really low inflow year. He had anticipated that and didn't let as much water out. But, you know, you can get yourself into situations on the drought end of things if you're managing your lake for flood prevention. So what we're looking at now is doing some additional studies to sort of look at, we have a really good understanding about the risk of different floods. We did climate modeling and everything, but now we need to look at, use those same models, but look at it, how it's gonna, what is the probability of a drought, and how is that gonna affect the sockeye salmon that have recently been restored to Okanagan Lake, and how's that gonna affect our ability to get irrigation water to all of the farmers in their valley and to the municipal water supplies. So we're trying to do this great big integrated analysis, and then having that lead to really an update of the Okanagan Basin study of 1970s. So
well, I
that's
just have a question related to that, because you know, I know that you've been wrestling with all of those very complicated balancing acts, and that's a bit. How are you preparing for greater variability and extreme climate change events?
See, this is very difficult. One of the things that we're trying to do, this is why I asked that question about the Canada Water Agency, is we're really trying to amp up our water monitoring. Water monitoring is important for long-term predictions in terms of what is happening with the flows coming into the valley. For example, when we were working on this, one of our latest hydrology studies that was related to all the flood mapping, they were looking at the last 50 years, 60 years of stream inflows. And they were, you know, as hydrologists do, they kind of look at all the pattern of the last 60 years and they try and have it be predictive for the next 50 years. But the problem is the last 10 years, the flows have been really different. And there was what they called a climate signal, a change in the flows. They were heavier, they were earlier in the spring, and then they were drier in the summer. And so we had to redo all the models to make up for this climate signal. So we need these long-term records of our stream flows. Much better records of the snow pillows, snowpacks. And so what we're trying to do at the Water Board is to greatly expand the monitoring that we're doing. We're going to do that in partnership with the Water Survey, the federal stations, but we're also going to put in some local stations, some locally run stations, and we're going to integrate it all into some kind of data management system that is compatible with the province and the federal government, so we can have a bigger amount of data to use. The other thing is it's really important for forecasting. If you want to know, is that snowpack that's up there on the mountain going to cause a flood down there in the lake? You have to have a better idea of it. Well, it looks like our moderators are telling us that they want to ask us some audience questions now, Bob.
Excellent.
You and I could just keep talking. We'll just, everybody else will go away.
Yeah, we've done
Go
that
to sleep. I think maybe Corinne is going to moderate our Q&A.
Hi there. I was letting you guys continue because I think there was some more there to be discussed, but you can get back to that later if you want. But yes, we do have a few questions. So the first one is from Nelson Detel. Thanks for a great presentation, Bob. Given China's 1.4 billion population with 0.3% growth at the watershed scale, what can we learn in the Okanagan from China, water governance and management?
Well, I think China has some similar problems on a much larger scale, of course. And I'm really glad, Nelson, thank you for asking this question, because population does play a huge role in the latitude that you have to manage in these circumstances. So China's done a number of things, wholesale mass transport of water from north to south, but they're still having a great number of problems. I mean, they're having internal migration from the dry regions, and what they're afraid of in China right now is something you might be interested in too. They're afraid of a pincer effect where because of rising sea levels on the coast, you've got people from flooding coastal regions moving inland, colliding with people from desiccated regions moving toward the coasts. And that's going to change the dynamic of human population and also water management parameters, as well as economics and also food production. So I think you can see from them the kinds of problems that you'll have on a smaller scale, but still a critical scale for you in the basin. So the example of China is rather interesting, because you're going to have people moving into British Columbia from the hotter, more desiccated prairies. You're going to have people moving from the coast inland. You're going to see those types of population pressures. And you're going to see how difficult it is to protect and restore aquatic ecosystems in the midst of those transformations when there's greater pressure for greater population density, etc. Now, what they have done is difficult because they are, of course, very fiercely autocratic in terms of the decisions they make. And a lot of people are displaced by those decisions, and it causes for tension. And but on the other hand, China is also claiming that it will be carbon neutral by 2060. And the reason why they do that, they recognize that warming temperatures and climate impacts are driving these factors and making them worse and making it harder and harder to manage not just the economy, but their agriculture, their water resources, and ultimately the stability of their entire society.
And I'll just give a plug for Bob's book called Quenching the Dragon, which he wrote a few years ago about China and water.
Well, thank you. It wasn't all that popular in China because I did that, but I think it's an important book. Okay.
Thank you. The next question is from Stuart Cohen, and this is for both of you. There has been some tension between strategies to increase water supply and other strategies to manage water demand. Climate change will affect both supply and demand. What do you think is the best way to prepare for future challenges in managing the supply-demand balance, given the future pressures of climate change and population growth?
Well, first of all, I want to say hello to Stuart, and that's another reason why I think you're so fortunate is you've got people like him around that, who can provide advice and deep knowledge of all of these factors. And my answer to your question, Stuart, and you won't be surprised at this at all, is that you've got to get on top of what's happening and what you expect might happen so that you're not acting out of urgency and emergency, that you can actually foresee the kinds of problems and challenges you have and make those kinds of balances based on a situational, on a situation by situation basis. And you are in this basin in a very critical situation that way, and have been ever since that I came to your basin to look at it. I mean, you have done a really good job of balancing these things so far. When I remember everyone going, well, geez, you know, if any place is going to have a real crisis here, it's going to be the Okanagan, and you've managed to prevent that from happening. And I think that proactive sense, that cooperation, and even more deeper cooperation with planning regional development will be necessary for you to be able to do that. Now, I'm sure Anna has many observations on the answer to that question.
I guess my first thing, I would say my biggest fear is how would we manage when we have another drought like they had in the late 1920s, early 1930s. I mean, that was a sustained, deep 3-year drought, and we have not seen that in the years since then, almost 100 years. So that is a major challenge. I don't think that we've gained out how that would work with our systems. We have the advantage of some large, deep lakes for emergency water supplies, but most of our systems are set up, as you know, for we have the reservoirs in the hills, and they would refill to a certain extent, but certainly it would be a major challenge for agriculture. I think one of the things that, and I don't want to just be too sanguine about this, but one of the things that we think about a lot at the Water Board is we have a bit of a buffer because we waste so much water. We have a lot of water capacity. It's the same thing with the food system. I keep thinking about this. You think about how Canadians, we waste what, like 60% of our food just gets thrown away. It's the same thing with water. A lot of our water is just, you know, sprayed out into the air, sprayed out of the car. It's, you know, we have more capacity in our system than we actually tightly use. So I think that that is an important part of
Well, I think that's really true, because I remember sitting down with Nelson, and he told me at one time, I hope I got this number right. If I don't, it's not his fault. But 24% of the water use that you had in municipalities was watering landscape. And if you're doing that, that means you've still got room to move. But the problem is that, and I think this is what Stuart's getting at too, is that if you have you've talked about a 3-year drought, if you have a 10-year drought, then that slack is going to be taken up. And we've seen widely in the world recently, especially in the last 5 years, and I spent a lot of time recently in India. And the problem is when you run out of slack,
yes,
then you run out of water, and
yes,
then you run out of options.
yes,
and that's what you want to avoid.
You can look at some of the, I mean, every once in a while for a reality check, I go and see how the water level's doing in Lake Mead. They don't ever think it'll ever refill. But I think what we're doing, the basic things of what we're doing, really digging into understanding our system, really building our social networks, our community networks, understanding where the water is wasted, how we can improve the efficiency, helping farmers improve the efficiency of what they're doing, and really working together. That's what's going to get us through this supply and demand balance. We'll do all the modeling, we'll do all the data collection, but an important part is going to be working at the community level and with the public, all the work that Corinne's doing with Okanagan Waterwise to really have the public buy in and be part of the solution.
Oh, and speaking to that, could I just ask you one other question before going to the other? So, given the emerging role of Indigenous communities in water management across Canada, for which I must say I am enormously grateful for that growing role, how is the Okanagan Basin Water Board working with local First Nations in the Okanagan?
We are committed to partnership. I think that, our partnership is growing and changing over time. I know the board is really committed to it. As a staff group, we're really committed to it. And we've been finding ways to help each other on our various projects. When we were doing our flood mapping project, it was the same time that the Okanagan Nation Alliance was doing their flood risk and debris flow study. And we had Okanagan Nation people on our steering committee. I sat on their steering committee. We were exchanging information. We've been working in a very close partnership on a lot of our stream flow monitoring and a lot of the fisheries studies. Just how can we complement each other? They have very strong skills in other areas. We have skills and connections in other areas. And we're just finding ways to work together. Nobody really knows what co-management looks like, but I think we figure that we will grow into co-management organically. And it feels like a very good, healthy, and very honest and sincere relationship without trying to force it into some preconceived idea of what it's supposed to be.
Well, that's interesting, because I'm increasingly of the view in my work elsewhere is that without First Nations leadership, and I mean leadership, not just involvement, we're not going to achieve any level of 21st century management of water and ability to deal with climate effects in this country. We need that thinking, we need those relationships, we need that trust, and we need their help and direction.
The traditional knowledge and the different ways of knowing that they bring to the table are unique and are really eye-opening. Once you start bringing in other fields of knowledge to the table in addition to the kind of traditional Western science, it can expand a lot of possibilities. You look at what they've done restoring the salmon.
Well, it's interesting that Environmental Flows conference that you had in October of 2018 was clearly co-designed, co-developed with First Nations in your basin. And that's why it worked.
So we have another question from Stephen Valentine. And this one I'm going to send over to Bob. But Anna, if you want to weigh in, then you can do that too. Do you have any examples of how linking environmental issues to other causes, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, helps to achieve the environmental goals? And is there a risk of an overly broad approach in diluting the message and action?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a requires a deep and considerate answer too. What I've seen that really works, and this may sound like an odd way to respond to a question like that. What I found, and perhaps that question, what's behind that question, is a frustration about not being able to go far enough, fast enough to get these sorts of sustainability initiatives to be functional and to be embedded in society. And I worked with, and have worked for the last 3 years in Manitoba. Well, I've worked for more than 15 years trying to improve the conditions of Lake Winnipeg, and we never got anywhere. We tried every angle, sustainability, we tried everything, and we just couldn't move anything to make it work. We were just essentially put into a tent with one another so that we could be observed and our comments noted, but no action was ever intended. So what we decided to do was we decided that we needed a completely different way of looking at it. And we used the transformational scenario planning that was used in South Africa to end the apartheid era to establish a completely new relationships with people in the basin. And what this demanded is for the first time that we would have full-scale involvement with First Nations. And for the first time in 150 years, we actually got the mayors, reeves, and the chiefs of First Nations who shared the basin together at the same table. It had never been done before. And we went through a reconciliation process, a truth and reconciliation process, not unlike what happened in South Africa, which was very painful and difficult for many people because of the honesty required. And it was tough, but I have to give all of those leaders great credit for hanging in there. But what emerged from that was a completely new way of working with one another. It was agreed that the status quo is simply inadequate and we cannot pursue it anymore. And so over a period of 2 years, they crafted a memorandum of agreement that they were never going to manage in the way that they did before in isolated jurisdictions and without considerations with one another. And at a signing of the memorandum of agreement at Lower Fort Garry, where the original Treaty 1 was signed, that memorandum of agreement was signed, and a reminted medal from the signing of Treaty 1 was given to each of the people with the notion that they were going to start over in their relationship with one another. And what that has led to a complete restructuring of governance and cooperation, which is finally now allowing us to get at the problems together on Lake Winnipeg. So I think we need to restructure many of the ways that we practice governance in this country if we don't want the limitations of governance to stand in the way of successful sustainability. We've been saying this for a long time. I know, Anna, when I first met her, we talked about the fact that, we know how to manage water. The problem with water management is governance. And I think if we can change the governance structures, we can get at and actually achieve a new level of trust, almost a post-colonial Canada in a way, in which the structures that serve us actually help us achieve the goals that we all want. And that's a better country for all of us, and sustainability that we can rely on, and also the adaptability and the capacity to deal with threats like climate and the other threats associated with that, while at the same time building a stronger society that will allow us to be more prosperous and more successful and maybe survivable in the future.
I saw a really inspiring little movie clip about that thing that you did in Manitoba, and maybe we can.
Well, it's very similar, Anna, to, in some ways, it's not the same order, but you were working in the same way in the basin. It's not quite the same structure. But I'll have to tell you that we could never get to the environmental issues unless we got right at and directly tackled the deep-seated racism that exists in Manitoba.
We'll try and find that movie. It's about 20 minutes long, and maybe Corinne can share it on.
Yeah, no, It's worth seeing. And one thing that's interesting, and I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but there was a Zoom call last week because everybody was afraid that we're going to lose momentum because of the pandemic. And many of the First Nations are really facing emergencies now because the virus has got into some of those remote places, which is a tremendous risk. But that meeting was all leaders. They all, but a few that were facing really serious COVID problems, attended, and I cannot believe the goodwill that has been generated as a result of that process and the willingness to keep it going and how much actually got done during this long lockdown. And it was astonishing. And it shows that we can have durable relationships. We can remake our country and our relationships with one another in ways that give us common belief in our ability to address these problems built on a new and deeper form of trust and cooperation. And I'm optimistic that way, and I'm optimistic for them as I am for you in your basin.
Thank you.
We have another question from Denise Nielsen. You mentioned, I think this is to you, Bob, you mentioned that our failure to control population growth will be a major impediment to a sustainable future. How would you propose that could be achieved?
Well, first of all, hello to Denise. Actually, I'd like to ask her that question. She's pretty sharp. So it's very, very difficult because what you have is a system that is heavily invested in itself, and area structure plans and all these planning devices aim for landscapes to be developed. But I think that you still have capacity within your political system to make decisions on how far you will allow this to go through densification and other things, so that you can continue to protect the significant ecological elements of the basin, especially the hydrological aquatic elements, so that you can still have that. But the question is absolutely central, not just to your basin, but to so many other places in this changing demographic that is the world today. And getting a handle on that is going to be one of the most difficult challenges and thorniest political problems that leaders are going to face. And I wish I had an easy answer for you, but I live in Canmore, and I see how difficult it is to manage growth, and especially once precedents have been set long ago and a great deal has been invested in those precedents, changes in population patterns and densities, etc., can be very, very difficult to achieve, and it's a challenge.
I don't want to go down the rabbit hole on this one, but I would say, in my mind, the most important thing right now is how we're living is more important than how many of us there are right now. So that's, I've had a couple kids move to Kelowna this year. You know, who's going to tell somebody else that their kids can't move back home? So I think the important thing is to, not be wasteful. Like we were talking earlier, like find ways that, people who live, lives where they're consuming a lot of stuff, they have a very big footprint, and we can have more people live here if we all are more conscientious about what we're using and what we're wasting.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that because you bring up something that I think is quite important. Actually, three things. First of all, we can change our impact and our footprint. We can do that by choice. That's really important. The second thing is the incredible power of youth. The attitudes of youth are being shaped by how they view the future. And also one of the things that I find most fascinating about the generations that are coming up now, they're starting with the knowledge that it took people my age an entire lifetime to gain. They're starting with that. And they know and understand these issues very well.
They don't have to unlearn all the crap that you learned.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Right?
But and I think we need to give their voice. They need to be at the table. We need to listen to them And because I think they're very wise beyond their years, many of them. They're very articulate and they're fiercely courageous. They are fiercely relentless citizens, and that's what you need. So that leads to the last thing, and it feeds on what you said, and I'm glad you said what you did, Anna, because as I said, this is a transformational moment. And it's a transformational moment for the kind of impacts that we have and the footprint that we have. And it's a transformational moment for young people, because those are the people who are going to be in the majority soon, and they are the people who are going to define our future. And they want that power because they know if they don't use it wisely, their future is going to be diminished. I have great faith in youth right now, and in many ways they are indeed my greatest hope.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Janice Larson. Bob, and Anna, if you want to weigh in, you certainly can, but do you have any concerns with the recently ratified Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement respecting Canada's water resources?
That's a very good question. I was involved the last time it came around, and actually I attended a major NAFTA conference before this reconsideration and renegotiation started. At the moment, my answer to that question is no, at the moment. But I'm still unclear, as many people are, about exactly what might trigger bulk water transmission to the United States. And again, this goes back to what we've been saying for a very long time, and one of the reasons why I think we need a Canada Water Agency, and why we need to reform the Canada Water Act, and why we need to use what you're doing in your basin as a model and an example for others, is this: we cannot afford to even concern ourselves with the growing thirst of our American neighbors at this point without first getting our own house in order. And we need to do that for all sorts of reasons, so we can manage our water better, so we can deal with the kinds of climate change threats that Anna has talked about in your basin, but also that are occurring widely. And we can't even begin to imagine what would happen if certain provisions within a newly crafted agreement might lead us into questionable waters. And even the last NAFTA thing was a little problematic in that we resolved it, but then you also look at Great Lakes Water Agreement, you look at some of these other things, and you also look at the fact that the US has declared water a national security issue. And as I've indicated to you, there's good reason for doing that. There's going to be places in parts of the dry Southwest, for example, communities are going to end up legally at war with one another over rights to who gets water for what. And we need to have our house in order so we can understand what it means, first of all, to us, and what we can do to help our neighbors. And until we do that, we're in a vulnerable position, in my opinion. And that agreement, again, it hasn't given me a great deal of deep comfort with respect to water security in this country at this point.
Interesting. Anna, is there anything that you want to say to this at all in terms of with the IJC? No. Okay.
No, I mean, my experience working with the IJC is that they're really, really committed to the keeping the peace, you know, working with our transboundary waters. The IJC oversees the Transboundary Water Treaty, and we've been able to maintain the peace with the US on a number of different water systems all along our shared boundary for many, many, many years. And I think that we have a good basic system in place for that kind of binational diplomacy that we're working on. I think people are pretty committed to it. I also think, you know, it's something that you want to be keeping a very careful eye on while you're developing those policies in each country.
I think also with respect to the IJC, that there's something really important that needs to be understood here. And
sorry,
again,
I'm just going to interrupt, Bob. I'm sorry. And just International Joint Commission for those that need to have that spelled out. I apologize.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. You're right to do that. But one of the things that we've had is that we've had a remarkable success with that. Many countries have really looked at Canada, the United States, and the success of the Boundary Waters Treaty and the International Joint Commission's ability to anticipate and resolve water issues before they become conflicts. And we built good relationships with the United States with that. But recently, and I say this probably since the Harper era, we have had fewer and fewer references to the IJC, joint national references for studies and resolution of conflicts. And there are many mounting issues that need to be addressed. Nutrient flows between the two countries, heavy metals, substances of emerging concern that need to be addressed. And these can't be done by the provinces and their neighboring states. They have to be done on to be truly effective. So what I'm really concerned about and wish to say is that we should be really, really careful not to reduce the effectiveness of institutions that actually work, that have worked in the past and could still work, and whose frameworks are adaptable to the circumstances that we have now. And I'm always worried that people say, well, that it's not effective, it takes too long for references to be answered. But in my examination of it, and I've known a couple of generations of IJC representatives from both sides of the border, it's certainly not the intention. And I just want us to be able to use the vehicles at hand that have worked in the past and not let them languish. And I hope that we don't do that. And again, this is a transformational moment for some of those institutions.
Okay. All right. Next question is for both of you from Adam Way. Thanks for the great talk. We know that climate is a major driver for water supply. We also know that land use changes, such as forest disturbance and urbanization, also play an important role in water. How can we manage both for future water when there are no such integrated management systems in place?
Well, the first thing is create them. I mean, that's a transformational moment, and I see you moving in some of this. I'm a little frustrated to see the lease sales in British Columbia include large swaths of old growth forests, and I show that it shows that not everything is integrated or organized or coherent there. So my argument is that we have to move to the creation of that integration. We absolutely have to do that before we reduce the capacity that we might have to use natural systems to buffer climate impacts, which we know they do, and also to restore them so that they can continue to do so and do more of that. And another thing that, I know this is a slight digression, I'll make it brief, but you know, we have also looking at the critical importance of soil health. And we know that we could probably reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by 20 or 25% if we restored soil health, which in ways is really important because it allows you capacity to absorb the impacts of drought and also improves your capacity to absorb the impacts of flooding. So there are lots of things that we need to do. There's much work left to do, as Anna and the Okanagan Basin Water Board fully understands.
And I guess I just want to say, you know, Adam, who asked the question, he's on the faculty at UBC Okanagan, and he's a specialist in forests and watershed. And I think, Adam, you know, you got to just bring it on, because definitely we need to talk about forests. We need to talk about water. We could totally use help from, you know, the university research community. The thing I keep thinking about is not just forests and snow and water, but also, yeah, we really need to start managing our forests for fire reduction. So we need to have some kind of, and this is not our area, but we need to get foresters involved and forest researchers involved so we can talk about, and the First Nations have a lot of ideas with this. There's a history of fire management of forests in the Okanagan, but we need to be able to, you know, either through selective burning, selective logging, to reduce fire danger and make the forest healthier. But then at the same time, how do you do that while you are also enhancing the forest's ability to collect and store water. I think that that is a huge question of the next decade that we really need to talk about.
Great, thank you so much. Next question is from Alyssa Smart. And Anna, we'll start with you, and if Bob wants to comment, then that's great. Do you think there should be an emphasis placed on preemptive behavior change as a mitigation strategy for water security and management? And if so, what have been effective strategies to achieve behavior change?
Preemptive behavior change. I'm not entirely sure what Alyssa means about that. My mind automatically jumps to face masks, which I know isn't the right answer. I think, you know, what we are doing a lot of with Okanagan Waterwise is trying to think about how do we get residents in the Okanagan, our communities, our tourist bureaus, our you know, city parks, everyone to think, like, reframe what kind of landscaping is appropriate in the Okanagan, and change their minds about how things should be here. I don't know if any of you have spent time in Arizona, like Tucson or Phoenix. All the landscaping, with the exception of some golf courses, I agree with, but that is definitely maybe an exception that proves the rule. They're all landscaped with the appropriate desert vegetation. We don't need desert vegetation, but we need vegetation that's appropriate for our semi-arid climate. And it would be wonderful. I would love nothing better than to see, you know, that be the norm in the Okanagan. And that would be something that not only would it make our communities beautiful and more unique and more kind of centered in place, but it would also make us more resilient to droughts and climate change. So that would be, you know, that's kind of top of my list for preemptive thing that I would love to see people do. And you know, we're trying to do our own small part in promoting that, both through the Make Water Work campaign that we have every summer, but also supporting Okanagan Xeriscape Association and many different other, you know, small initiatives.
I just have one comment on that. You know, we know what to do better, and we're learning more and more about how hydrology works and how we can do things better. And so the thing for me is always, don't go backwards, go forwards. And, you know, don't let rollbacks of regulations happen like is happening in the United States. The United States right now, you want to talk about preemptive behavior changes, is putting the country back 50 years. The same thing is happening here. And so consequently, voting for going forward is really important for us, and to be clear on what we're going forward with. Which reminds me, I urge you all to vote on Saturday.
I think I was just going to make one quick comment to Alyssa, and just note that Anna had mentioned the Make Water Work campaign that we do, which is aimed at residential outdoor water use, and how we use something called community-based social marketing, who some might be familiar with, but using psychology along with the marketing tools to really get at that behavior change that we're looking for. So we use that quite extensively with that effort. But I think another thing is, you know, in terms of that preemptive behavior change, is that we need more examples of local governments in our valley doing it right too. So Anna talked about parks and that sort of thing, and just ways that we can stand as examples of what we are asking the local landowners and property owners to do. Okay, so there is another, I think this might be our last question unless we get another one under the wire there. Last one. I wonder if there is any water conservation behavior as part of the discussion and relevant interventions to encourage such sustainable behavior as the mass consumers level to deal with the mounting demand for water. Being nearly ideal, how does Indigenous water conservation behavior inform the ways and means to treat water as sacred and precious to the rest of the society? And how challenging is that to get Indigenous knowledge married with the modern technologies for sustainable solution? And are there any examples?
Well, that's a lot to answer. But first of all, I want to say that if we don't learn from Indigenous people about the critical nature of water, the sacredness of water, and how water informs all life and all circumstances. And if we don't understand as they do that without water, you cannot live on landscapes for long. And if we don't understand and learn from that deep respect that they have, we're probably not going to be successful over the long term. I remember, I noticed a very quick digression. I was in Buenos Aires at a conference, and in South America, there's a tremendous resistance to accepting Indigenous knowledge and a lot of really serious racial relations problems. And there was a long discussion about whether or not we should be following Western science or the role of traditional knowledge. And it went on for several hours. And finally, this very famous American hydrologist said, you know, I've been listening to this for a long time. I just want to report to you, if this was a scientific experiment, and this is one we were doing in Western science to see who could survive the longest based on their values. Well, our societies might make it 500 years. They've been doing it for 10,000 years. I suspect their experiment has worked much more successfully than ours. So I think we need to adopt those. I think we need to listen very carefully to what they have to say, and also to the practices, and also to give the deep respect that water deserves to water, and hold it in that regard. And if we moved in that direction, it answers your previous question also about preemptive behavior. If you had a different attitude for water and saw it for what it is and does for the world, rather than just turning on the tap and expect it to come, that would certainly change your view of this, and it might change your view of everything that water does for us to make life possible on the planet. And we might move back to a more holistic way of understanding the world that would lead to a reduced footprint and again, this transformational moment occurring. So this is a good question. We need this is a good time to listen.
I would echo what Bob said. It is a good time to listen. I think we're at a really interesting time societally here in British Columbia, where the conversation is really growing and expanding. I'm sure that it's true throughout Canada, but my experience is in British Columbia. A lot more dialogue is happening. There's a lot more opportunities for learning from different First Nations, Indigenous communities. There's a lot of Indigenous folks on social media that I've been following, been taking that free course on Coursera from the University of Alberta. There's a lot of new, interesting information that's out there and is becoming accessible. And I don't think that I have an answer right now for what the right thing is to do with water conservation and Indigenous knowledge. I'm just in the middle of, I feel like I'm in the middle of having a lot of conversations about it and going to events with the local Indigenous community and hearing from them, hearing these elders telling me how weird it is to see green lawns in the summer, and they just think it's strange. And, just like mind expanding, different perspective, really super healthy. And I'm happy to be alive at this time where we're in a renaissance of knowledge exchange.
Okay, we have one last question under the wire. So this one's from Tracy Davis, and I think it comes from some of the discussion. So, will there be recommendations put before councils to change the city, district landscaping in municipalities, parks and rec, and to install water barrels to capture water for irrigation and mitigating flooding? I still see lots of turf and annuals in public spaces.
Well, our approach has been to work directly with municipal staff and with the parks departments, working through providing grants, getting the mayors involved in the Make Water Work Challenge. It's a slow process to change community culture, and our approach has been to do it gently and just understanding that there's a history there for why things are as they are, and slowly moving the mayors and the councils into the position of being influencers. And I feel like it's working. I felt like that challenge that we had this summer with all the mayors going up against each other, and that neck on neck competition between Spell Machine and the city of Armstrong to who was going to have the most water conservation citizens. I mean, I feel like it's, we're getting in there. It's not overnight transformation. Maybe this is speaks of what Bob said earlier about maybe we need to have a stronger sense of urgency. I feel like when we have slow, steady change, I feel like maybe this is my personality too, just like I want to change things fundamentally. I want to have a big shift. And I feel like that can happen if we have a big, strong community level shift over time. And so that's kind of the way that we're approaching it.
I just my only comment on that is that I hope you have time. I mean, if you want to change all of the municipal rules regarding vegetation, etc., you know what it would do for you is a 5-year drought. So I think it's important to move that way, and I'm glad to hear that the communities are competing with one another. And I urge you to really move this along, because I fear for you. I really do.
I think I would like to just mention one more thing on that topic, is that, of course, we did a recent update to our water supply and demand numbers and looking where water is being used. And those are on the Okanagan Waterwise website now at okwaterwise.ca, so people can see where our water is being used. And outdoor water use in parks is not as high as some might think. So where we have found there to be, where we have a lot of room that we can work with, is within the residential landscape. And agriculture uses a tremendous amount of water, but of course it's feeding our communities, and we are working with that sector to find ways to be more water wise as well. But I think it would be interesting for folks to see where water is being used in our valley, and they can find those now on our Waterwise website at okwaterwise.ca.
And I don't want to say that you're not right in recommending that we
Absolutely.
go to the councils. It hasn't been something that we've done so far, but it certainly is something that we can look at. It just hasn't been our approach at this time, but I'm hearing you, and we'll talk about how we can be more direct and, as Bob says, more urgent.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so we're about to wrap up, and so was there any last comments at all from Bob or Anna at this point?
I just want to say how fabulous it is to have Bob back in the Okanagan, if only virtually. It's wonderful to hear from you, and to be able to tap into this giant fountain of knowledge. And really appreciate, glad to see that you're healthy, and glad to see that you are still hanging in there in Canmore, not having to travel as much.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's kind of interesting. But I want to thank you for the invitation, and it is good to connect with you again. And just know that wherever I am, I'm in your corner. So I wish you all good luck, and I wish you a very successful next 50 years.
Thank you. I will be 105.
I'll be older and grumpier.
Okay.
Well, with that, I wish to thank James, who's been working in the background, helping make sure that things were staying working in the background, so that's fantastic. So thanks to James. And thank you, Anna. Thank you, Bob. And thank you to everyone who stayed and joined us this evening. And we invite you to mark November 12th down on your calendars, when we'll be hosting a similar event to mark the OBWB's 50th anniversary and hold a discussion with New York Times bestselling author Seth M. Siegel, who's the author of Let There Be Water, Israel's Solution for a Water-Starved World, and Troubled Water, What's Wrong with What We Drink. And you can find more information about those events and register at you can find information at our website at okwaterwise.ca, but also on Eventbrite. And with that, I think we're done.
Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks, James.
Yeah,
Thanks for a fabulous evening.